Hello everyone. In this video we're going to be installing the crank. So in preparation of that, got my rear oil seal here, and I've prepped it by putting a bead of silicone along the edge there. I'm going to go ahead and put it in this groove. It really only goes in one way, so not that hard to do. Okay. And what I do is make sure it's flush on the surface here. Okay, feels pretty good. And I take a couple of washers and nuts, and I'll tighten this down and just let it sit till that silicone dries. This makes sure that it's all pressed down nice and tight in there. Yeah, I'll just let that sit. Earlier when I was looking at this crank, I found that whoever put this sleeve on didn't put the oil slinger washer on there. So I had to take this washer off of another crank, remove the oil slinger sleeve, and then install it all back together. It was kind of a pain because getting it off the old one was kind of tough. But anyway, even though I know this crank was at the machine shop and machined and everything, and it really does look like these are new plugs in there, I'm still a proponent for cleaning these things out, and I just want to check. Now if I pull this one out and I find it's clean in there, I'm not going to bother pulling the other ones out. But I am going to pull one out just to make sure what I think is right is right. But we'll see. We'll find out. So normally I'll drill a little hole in there, and that'll allow me to put a screw in there. There it goes. Popped right out of there. Oh yeah, it's clean in there. The only thing I see is the metal shavings from me drilling. Got to get them out of there. Okay. Yep, it's all clean. Good. I have these Dorman plugs. Let's see. 555-001 expansion plugs. They fit the smaller holes for the crank. If you have a Merc crank, it might be a different part number. But with these smaller holes, that's the one you want. I've got a little red Loctite here and a punch. I want this to come out on me. go. And I'll take another little punch that has a point on it. And I'll peen that down to where that plug can't come out again. So when I was kind of preparing the block for the crank installation, and I was measuring the bearings, the main bearings, I didn't like the way they looked. They were kind of scratched up, and started measuring them and stuff, and I don't think they were new, so I went ahead and ordered new bearings, new main bearings and stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the main bearings in and do some measuring and make sure my oil clearances are good for all these bearings. So let me get these bearings installed. Well, let me just show you real quick. Okay, so the block has little machined out areas for what they call a tang, or I call it a tang. And on the bearing there's a tang. So when you install these, you install that tang on the bearing to the tang on the block. It's pretty simple, but you know, it's information to know. And I just press them down to where it seems to be pretty flush. When I torque that main cap on, it'll put it perfect, but I try to get them close. And then I'll put the bearings in the block, I'll put the bearings in the caps, and I'll go ahead and torque them down, and then I'll get out my bore gauge and I'll check my oil clearances. There is holes in the bearing, and when you put them in there, you just want to make sure that the hole in the bearing matches the hole in the block, because that's how the oil transfers to the bearing. And really it's only the rear main bearing that you could probably get them backwards if you didn't notice that, but because the main bearing oil hole is offset. But anyway, just make sure that the hole in the bearing matches the hole in the block so the oil can get in the bearing. And when you install the caps, told you about the tang there. Well, there's a tang there. The tang should go on the same side. Tang, and then on this side would be the tang. Let's put them on there. On the front cap, there's a little bit different. This little machined out area for the front one is a little bit closer to that bolt hole. You can tell the difference when you put them together. So that's something to watch out for also. Anyway, just put it together, tang on tang, and that should be good. Okay, so this is the rear of the crank here, and this is the rear main. So what I'm doing is I have my mic set up, and I get a reading of where I'm at, where the crank journal is at. These are milled 10 under. So then I'll take that, and I'll move that dial till I get a 0. A little over 2.5. So that's good. You have 1 to 3 thousandths. So now I'll go ahead and check the other main bearings. Rear main seal has been sitting for quite a while with the washers and everything pressed down and sealed in, the holder anyway. And there was some gaskets included with this engine. They were older gaskets. And I put this rear main rope seal in here, and it just didn't seem like it was long enough for my likings, because it's supposed to sit above the holder a little bit, and it's not. So I went ahead and just ordered a new full gasket kit, and in that kit you get new rope seals and a couple other items. I'll show you what they're used for. So anyway, I'm going to take out that that old rope seal, since I'm not going to be using it. I just didn't think it was long enough. I definitely don't want to leak, so tape the rope seal a little bit. Just slide it in there. I'll take the wooden handle of a hammer or something, just something around the diameter there, so you can try to press that in and get that in there as good as you can. Then they provide you with this, which is basically the thickness of the pan gasket. And you put the pan gasket on. Then they give you the popsicle stick so you don't cut your thumb or finger. And use that little piece there. And they give you a knife so it's nice and sharp. You want something nice and sharp. Something like that. And you do that to the other side. Also going to do that to the rope seal that's in the oil pan. Do the same thing. In preparation of putting the crank in, I'm lubing up the bearings, cleaned up the cam gear, lubing that up. There's a little dot on the cam gear. I put that, you got to put it up so that when you put the crank in, the dot on the crank gear aligns with the dot on the cam gear. Alright, I put the bearings in after measuring and everything. Everything looked fine, and I went to put the crank in. I set the crank in just with the bottom, or with the top bearings in. Spun it, it felt fine. So then I went ahead and put the caps on, tightened them down and everything, and I was checking the crank to make sure it still turned fine as I was tightening them down, and it started to get tight, and that's not a good sign. So what I did is I took everything, I took the caps back off, I made sure the bearings were all seated really good in the caps and in the block. I removed the rear rope seal because I just want to make sure that the crank spins fine on the bearings, and the rope seal was creating some drag, so I removed that. And I also removed the cam timing gear, so there's no other drag except where the crank and the main bearings, where the crank is sitting in the main bearings. And now I've went through, put the caps back on, torqued them all down to specs, and it does spin freely now. Feels good. So I don't know if one of the caps or the bearings wasn't quite seated right, or maybe that rear main seal was creating too much drag. It was just, didn't feel right. But now that I know that it's nothing to do with the main bearings or anything like that, I'm okay with that. If I put that rear main seal back in, there's a little drag, it's just because it's a rear main seal. So, and I know that the bearings are seated now because everything spins freely. So I'm going to have to take these caps back off, put in the rear main seal again, and then I'll go ahead and reinstall the crank. Alright, got the crank back out, got the rope seal back in, put assembly lube on the rope seal. I'm putting assembly lube on all the bearings. Make sure you get it on the thrust surfaces of the rear main bearing, front and back, and then yeah, just assembly lube on all the bearing surfaces now, and I'll drop that crank back in. And it probably won't spin as easy because that rear rope seal is in there now, creating friction. Okay. Again, when you're putting in these bearings, tang side to tang side. Tap them, make sure they're seated really good. I'm just repeating the way I did it before to make it move smooth. When I did it before, I was doing each bearing to see which one I had a problem with. Okay. Alright, I'm going to check my crank end play. I have the crank pushed all the way forward, and I've got my dial indicator and it's set to 0. So when I push it back, it should give me the clearance. Okay, that is reading 1, 2, 3, 4 thousandths. And my book calls for 2 to 6 thousandths, so we're in the range there. Alright, so now I know that the crank is good. I went ahead and safety wired each one of these bolts. Well, I think I'm gonna stop this video here. That's the end of the crank installation, so it's a good point to stop. As always, thanks for watching.